So the first thing that I'm going to discuss is medical certificates, which is obviously quite a big, important area when it comes to sick and injured employees, and what's actually required when someone is sick from the workplace. So the Fair Work Act sets out that if an employer requires an employee to provide some evidence, that they must do so and it must satisfy a reasonable person. So it doesn't actually say that medical certificates are specifically required. It could be a medical certificate, it could be a statutory declaration, or some other evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person. The next thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly and maybe then get some discussion going is leave policies. I know I've got a couple of clients here that we've helped to implement leave policies for. Does anyone here have a leave policy or not have a leave policy, and how do they find that works? Yeah? Yeah? Does anyone not have a leave policy?
Absolutely.
No, okay. So what do you do when it comes to an employee being sick? How do they know if they're meant to bring in a medical certificate, or is it an individual basis that you approach them?
It's sadly for the line manager above them to manage. If they believe them, obviously they're not going to challenge it.
Okay.
And then they have to when they come back to work, they have to ask for the sick leave to be approved so that they get paid for it.
Sure. Okay. Well, look, I've found that having a leave policy can be really, really helpful in just setting out expectations. Sometimes if employers have enterprise agreements in place or awards with particular requirements, that can set out exactly what an employee has to do, but often they don't, or in smaller businesses that maybe aren't covered by awards or aren't big enough to have an enterprise agreement, it's often just left unknown and on a case-by-case basis dealt with. So a leave policy can really clearly specify what is required. For example, if you have 2 days sick as an employee, are you required to bring in a medical certificate? Or if you're sick on a Monday or a Friday, are you required to bring in a medical certificate? So it's things like that that you can set up and then can be given to employees so they know exactly what to expect and what they have to bring in. The other thing that's really important with a leave policy is not just having one, but applying it consistently. Obviously, some people you might be a bit more worried about, why are they on sick leave, or they've taken a lot of sick leave, so you're wanting to get some information about that. And others you may not be so worried, as you were mentioning, it's left up to the manager to decide. But really it's important to apply it consistently so that the whole workforce knows exactly what's expected and they don't feel that they can get out of something because another person hasn't had to provide it. The third thing that's really important to have in a leave policy is a sentence that sets out that if that policy isn't complied with, that there could be disciplinary action. And that's important specifically so that employees actually do what the policy says and don't just think it's some sort of aim that they should try to do but maybe they don't have to do. It's also really important to manage sick leave and let people know that this is something that's important, that the company takes seriously, and that you're not just meant to be taking sick days off whenever you like because you feel like a bit of a rest. So yes, I just really advise if you don't have a leave policy, you should strongly think about putting one in place. They're usually very short policies and you can include things like annual leave or other types of leave in that policy as well. So the next topic, which is a bit more meaty, is when can you question a medical certificate? And this is certainly something that gets raised with me by a lot of HR managers that maybe think a certificate's a little bit dodgy, or they don't quite understand why that person keeps taking sick leave but they keep bringing in medical certificates. So basically what a medical certificate needs to do is satisfy a reasonable person. So it's an objective test, and unfortunately doctors aren't required to say what exactly the illness is on a medical certificate, so it can just say that the employee is unfit. And I think that's something that causes a lot of problems sometimes when the employer wants to find out more information and they feel that they can't. There's two situations that I see regularly The first one is where the employer suspects that the employee is doing something else. You know, they've gone to the beach, or they've gone on holiday, and they're not really sick, they're just taking it easy. Those sorts of situations where maybe someone sees something on social media showing that they've gone off to a concert, or, you know, they could really be at work. So that's the first type of situation. The second type is just a situation where there's something a bit strange about the medical certificate, and the manager or employer isn't quite sure if it's the real deal. And there are ways to try and address that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with calling a medical practice up and confirming, did you issue this medical certificate? And I know when I've raised it with HR managers, well, why don't you ring up and confirm it? They've often said, oh, am I allowed to do that? I didn't think I could do that, because it's not the same as requesting further information. You're just confirming the certificate. So you don't have a right, without consent from the employee, to approach their doctor and have a general conversation about, you know, well, why were they sick and what treatment are they receiving or anything like that. You do need consent for that, but certainly confirming a medical certificate is absolutely fine. And, you know, if your employee knows that you're going to do that, maybe that's going to make things a little bit easier to deal with. So I wanted to just briefly go through a case which deals with one of these situations where maybe you're suspecting that an employee isn't really sick, or you know the employee isn't really sick. So this particular case, the employee, Anderson, had informed a co-worker that he was going to a soccer match, and he was going to take a day off sick to go to the soccer match. And then the colleague raised that with the manager, and it sort of went up the chain until this employee was questioned. You know, we've heard that you're going to a soccer match and you're going to take the day off sick. You can't actually do that, and that would be, you know, an abuse of the process that we have in place. The employee went off and got a medical certificate, took the day off, went to the soccer match and got a medical certificate that said that he was unfit to attend work. And the employer obviously questioned that and said, well, if you were fit enough to go to this soccer match, I think you were probably fit enough to come into work. The individual then tried to say that they were emotionally unfit to attend work because of the soccer match, and because their favourite player was retiring. You know, they had this strong emotional connection, and they were really upset about it and had to go and watch the soccer match. So it's an interesting case. It's probably not the sort of thing that's going to happen every day in the workplace, but I think it's a good example of what to do if you do suspect something's a little bit strange. You know, maybe they are doing something else and they should have been at work. So the judge in this case, although he reiterated that yes, medical certificates are legal documents, said, well, they are, but you can question them. And what ended up happening in this case is that it was held that the doctor, who was actually cross-examined, shouldn't have issued the medical certificate and didn't question the employee enough. And that really this was a misuse of sick leave entitlements, and therefore when the employer terminated them, they had every right to do so because it was a misuse. So while it's a bit of an extreme example, I think it just illustrates quite well that if you go through a process of, you know, putting it to the employee, were you really sick? Or, for example, if something's seen on social media, which nowadays it often is, were you at the beach? Because here's an example of a picture of you at the beach on that day, and getting some more information. You're in a much better position than just leaving it, letting it linger, and then maybe they think, oh, well, that's okay, I'll keep doing that. And you end up with a workforce that thinks it's fine to do that.
So was that one incident sufficient to terminate
Yes.
employment, or had other things?
No, it was just the one incident.
And is that alluded to in
Okay.
their policy document that gave them the strength, that their policy alluded to the fact that this could include action, including your termination
They did have a policy that had disciplinary action in there if there was any sort of...
and potential termination?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And it's important to say, as well as disciplinary action, to make it clear, and termination, or may include termination. Because often a lot of people don't necessarily understand what disciplinary action means, or think that it's some sort of, you know, small, here's a warning and do do better next time.
And I think one of the reasons a policy is so important on this issue, particularly if you've got a bit of a problem in the workplace, is the number of times we've seen employers and employees who actually believe that as long as you've still got accrued personal leave, it's almost like yours to take. And that is not true at all. Personal leave is for specific circumstances. But we've been surprised at how many times people say, but if they've got accrued personal leave, and there are issues about accrued personal leave in terms of terminating them, but we'll come to that later, but it's not just, oh, I've got 2 days personal leave on my pay slip, I'm going to take it, and that's another issue, just, Lucy will probably come to it, never put accrued personal leave on a pay slip, but anyway.
Yeah, that's an important one, because then people think it's their right and they should take it. Another key thing that I wanted to mention about policies is that they're really good for setting out who does the employee have to contact when they are sick, how, and when. So can they leave it until 10 o'clock in the morning if they're meant to be in at 8:30? Should they be contacting their friend via email saying, oh, by the way, just let so-and-so know I won't be in today? I find that if there's a bit more of a stringent policy in place, that can discourage people from taking sick days when they're not really sick. So
make them
call in, basically.
Don't text, make them phone. That if there's someone with an issue, make them phone and make them phone a specific person.
And if we put that in a policy document and they text, that's non-compliance with our policy.
That's correct.
I wouldn't sack
You wouldn't
them for
necessarily
that,
sack them. But you could give them a warning.
I'm sure they'll have laryngitis.
Yeah.
Sorry, just on the question, we've talked about post-dated medical certificates,
Yes.
backdated ones as well are outside. It's an AMA policies, it's not actual Fair Work Australia.
That's
or
correct.
anything
So
like
it's an
that.
AMA guideline, so the doctor can be disciplined under AMA regulation, but it's not something that the Fair Work Act can necessarily look at. You could question it and say, my understanding is they can't provide backdated certificates, and that could be the basis of a conversation of, were you really unwell, or did you go to the doctor later and try and get something because you knew under the policy that you needed a medical certificate?
But given that someone can actually write a stat dec,
It doesn't often happen.
so in the policy, you state medical certificate, even
Yes,
though you
you
know
can do
they
that.
can provide you with
Yes.
a stat dec.
Yes. I mean, most people don't know how to do a stat dec,
No.
and you have to then find someone to witness it. And there's only certain
And
types
how
of
to do it,
professions, and so most people will do a medical certificate if they're asked.
So
And I think most,
sorry,
I was going to say most JPs or solicitors, if you had somebody doing a stat dec for you about an illness, most will say, you can go to jail if this is a lie, because it's not something that people take
Pretty
lightly.
serious.
yeah, but they're only signing to say I'm witnessing your signature. They're not signing to saying they're complicit in the matter within the stat dec.
Not at all, and they're not complicit because they have no idea whether it's right or wrong.
Correct.
But I think that most people would sort of say, that you must be truthful,
Yes.
just to the person.
So what would be other examples, and I get that we don't want to really be putting this in our policies, but what would be other examples of evidence that you've seen that you would see a third-party arbitrator would consider reasonable?
I was having a bit of a think about this earlier today, and I haven't really seen any other sorts of evidence except for medical certificates or stat decs. I mean, it might be something like you've seen that the person is unwell and they've gone home, that potentially
mum
could
called.
be evidence.
That's
But
not going to work.
yeah, no, I don't think my mum call would work.
And with personal leave, it also becomes a bit of an issue. Like you can sometimes need the medical certificate in relation to the person you're caring for.
Yes.
Um,
Are there any other questions or comments about medical certificates just before I move on to the next topic?
One question about medical cert, how long can a doctor certify someone unfit for work before seeing them again?
Well, that's a good question, because I've seen medical certificates that go for months, and I have questioned those and said I can't understand how a doctor could possibly, and I knew what the illness was, could possibly say that that person will be sick for months. That's the sort of situation where you try to get consent to talk to their doctor and find out more information.
I think there's no actual, the guidelines, there's no actual limit,
No.
but I think in practice, they've said to doctors there's no special circumstances for more than 2 weeks. usually, if it's more than 2 weeks, it's got to be for some really special reason,
Like
you know,
surgery and they're
surgery,
recovering and they know how long or roughly how long it's going to take.